Today's topic, Civil 3D pond design and analysis. Just a brief outline here, and then we'll jump into Civil 3D to get started on some different examples. So we'll start out and we'll spend the majority of the time on the grading of these ponds or the design of these ponds. We'll use a few different tool combinations to accomplish this. The one on the screenshot on the right is just made up of a few feature lines and a Kogel point. We'll also include use of grading tools and different combinations of feature lines and grading tools. It really depends on the design of the pond that you're working on. With some of the analysis, we'll look at different volume calculations methods. Primarily, the main one is using volumes dashboard. We'll cover how to use that and what kind of surfaces you have to make to create those volumes. And then we'll introduce the stage storage tool it's been around for a while there. Maybe some folks aren't used to it or aware of it though, and I'll show how that works, and that's to get not just a overall bulk storage of your pond, but a staged storage. And then we'll look at exporting that to storm and sanitary analysis, and I'll just do a brief import of it as well into SSA. I won't spend much time there, but just show you where and how that pond definition can be imported into SSA for further analysis with your storm network there. So from here we're going to jump into Civil 3D, and the remainder of this will be a live demonstration. So I'm going to start with a simple file I have with an existing surface in here. And we're going to go through a few different pond design examples. The first one is going to be a fairly, I'll say kind of freehand, maybe kind of an artsy pond design where things aren't very symmetrical or parallel. And then we'll move into one that's maybe a little bit more parallel. And then the final example will be a more complex combination of different tools, including tying into an adjacent parking lot right next to it. So all that kind of all that is involved with designing and grading your ponds. And so I'm going to start this very freehand right here. I'm going to start by drawing some polylines, one of them initially, and then we're going to start turning these into feature lines and grading out a pond surface. So if I'm drawing a very kind of freehand pond, I like to use the polyline command. And then I like to do A for arc and S for second point. And it gives me this option to be able to jump into a very kind of free-flowing sketch mode of a pond here. Okay, so maybe it's shaped something kind of like this, and we'll close it right there. Tweak it just a little bit. Okay, so whatever the shape is, it's shaped like a, you know, it's got a curve to it, an S shape to it, whatever it might be. This is kind of a real free-flowing type pond design. It's where you're not having all these typical slopes or typical widths for benches or something like that, for example. So we're going to draw that polyline there. I'm going to draw one more kind of in the middle here, and again do that arc and second point option where I can a little bit more freehand draw in these polylines. Okay, so still just 2D polylines at this point. We're going to go right up to our feature line command here and create feature lines from these objects. All feature lines belong on a site, and we're going to pick the pond 1 site here. Those of you who are fairly new to feature lines and sites, what a site is it's basically a container that you place objects in. And you put them in the same site when you want them to interact, or you put them in separate sites when you don't want them to interact. So a site isn't something you see on screen. It's basically a container that will show up in your tool space on the left side of the screen there. So we're going to assign elevations And initially, we're going to pull elevations right from existing ground as a starting point. Okay, so again, that site, it shows up in your prospector over here. That's my site. Again, it's not on screen here. So feature lines, if two feature lines are in the same site and they cross, they assume the same elevation at the crossing point of the last edited feature line. So let's take a look at this first feature line. I'll grab this guy. I'm going to use my elevation editor, a very basic feature line editing command. I can come in here and do a Control A. I like to use Elevation Editor for mass edits. I don't come in here and do point-by-point editing. That's what this tool is great for, quick elevation edit. We'll use some more of that later on. When you're doing mass edits, want to change 4 or 5 points at a time or the entire feature line, Elevation Editor is nice for that. So I can come in here and set this to perhaps 336. Set the whole feature line at 336. Let's grab this other one here and set this feature line to, let's say, 332. Okay. And all I'm going to do here is add these into the surface as break lines. But there's a couple parameters at play here that some folks aren't aware of, and I want to be sure to point them out. So I'm picking these feature lines and I'm saying add to surface as break line. It's a nice right-click command. And we're going to add it to a surface called Pond 1. Pond 1. And for the style, we're going to start out by giving it the contours and triangles style so that we can see the tin itself as well as the contours. Hit OK and hit OK. And right off the bat here, I get this Add Break Lines dialog box. Most of you have probably seen this before. I want you to pay attention to the supplementing factors down there. This is very important not just with pond design using feature lines like this, but with any kind of general feature line site grading. The supplementing factors, if I have this checked on and it's set to 10, on straight segments of my feature line, it's going to triangulate, or the tin is going to connect at least at 10-foot intervals. Even if I had a 200-foot length straight segment at a constant grade, it would connect at least every 10 feet. Mid-ordinate distance, that has to do with triangulation along curves. In this case, all we have is curves. So this is really going to come into play here with how much it triangulates. And the translation is triangulation, the amount of it, plays a big role in how your contours look. They can also make your drawing real big, so there's kind of a nice balance here. Enough triangles to get decent looking contours. For a mid-ordinate distance, I'm going to start out at 0.2. Okay, I'll hit OK. So what mid-ordinate is specifically? Okay, if I go and take a look at this, just so we understand what we have here. There's my pond. Okay, a little shallow at this point. But what mid-ordinate distance is it's how the tin is approximating curves in the break lines. So there can't be curves in your tin. So what it does is approximate this curve with a number of chords or straight segments. And what the mid-ordinate distance is that distance between the midpoint of a curved segment and a straight segment. So if I run a distance command right here, let me do a regen and get that to update a little bit. A distance command right there to approximately right there. You see that distance was 0.19. Okay, so it's just under 0.2. What that means is if I drop the mid-ordinate distance down, I'm going to get more triangulation along these curves. There's a nice balance to strike there, and it's all about how much do you need to get decent looking contours, and we all know that's important in our plans. So let's do this. Let's go into the surface properties. Let's go to the definition of that surface and let's remove these. Okay, unfortunately, to change those supplementing factors, you have to remove the break lines and then add them back in. Not a big deal though. Add surface to break line. We're going to add it to pond 1. This time, let's say 0.1. And now we have a lot more detail. And as a result, our contours will look a little better. Now in areas like this where the two break lines are nearly parallel or concentric, it works out pretty nicely. From here we can interface with these feature lines. Let's grab this feature line perhaps. Let's do a raise lower. Let's bring it down 3 feet. And if my surface is set to rebuild automatic, I will see that update and see additional contours. Now what about this? These contours aren't necessarily looking the way I want them to. And we can really understand this with the tin on. Okay, there's one big triangle in the middle here. It looks great on this side, and again it's because these two break lines are mostly concentric. But when you get over here, they're not so concentric or parallel anymore, and the tin doesn't really know what to do. What we may want is for tin lines to be going from here right up to there, but instead they're just crossing right here, and we've got a flat spot up here. So how do you do this? How do you control that? Well, you could swap edge 50 times and clean that stuff up. The better, more dynamic way to handle it is to put in a couple other break lines. In this case, feature lines. So we could draw feature lines right from this corner right up to here, or we could do something else. Let's do this instead. Let's kind of split the difference between these two break lines. So I'm going to start with just a polyline command again. And I'm going to kind of split the difference between these two pieces of geometry. And why am I doing this? Okay, it triangulates the way we want when things, again, are parallel and concentric. It doesn't do it so well when they are not. So we have to kind of split the difference and throw one more break line in here, possibly even a second one. Let me actually put 2 in here. So you might be thinking, well, why are you deciding that that goes there and this goes there? Well, this is kind of the artistic side of grading with feature lines, freehand grading like this. Okay, so I'm gonna actually join this and make one feature line out of this. Turn that into a feature line. I'm going to throw it into the same site, and I'm going to assign elevations from the pond surface. Okay, this is a very invaluable tool, the ability to assign elevations from a surface. If you're not familiar with this, you definitely want to be aware of it. So I can take this now and I can add this to the surface as a break line with the same supplementing factors. And right off the bat, we'll get better looking contours. In fact, let's turn the tin off. It'll be a little easier to see. Okay, so better looking contours right away. And it's just because we've controlled triangulation a little better. I also kind of have a little platform up here. Okay, maybe you don't want that. We can come into here, we can tweak these elevations a little bit, right? So pick on that feature line, quick elevation edit, one of the best feature line editing tools. You can pick this and bring that down to 332 perhaps. 332.5 on this side perhaps. Maybe back to 333, okay. And so on and so forth. Okay, so this is very kind of freehand pond design. You have a pond, you want to go down to a point at the bottom, use a Kogel point. Point creation tools, do a manual point right in the bottom here. For description, I'll call it pond 1. And for an elevation, we'll say 325. Okay. I don't recall what we had this feature line at. This feature line is at, so that lower circle one is at 329. Let's bring that up just a little bit actually. Go to the properties of that Kogel point. Instead of 325, let's go to 327 perhaps. Okay. Managing points, the best way to handle that is through point groups. Make a point group called pond 1, and in it say reference all points with pond 1 as the description. Okay, that's updated, that's in that point group. I can now go to my pond 1 surface and I can add that point group, that pond 1 point group to my pond 1 surface. And now it triangulates in there, and I get a low point in there. Okay. Bring it down a couple feet perhaps. A little more triangulation, deeper pond. Bring that down to 325. What about tying in out here? Let's draw another feature line. And I'm going to again use this kind of polyline freehand tool where I draw arcs freehand like this. Okay. And what I'm drawing in are my grading limits basically here. Okay. So it's not a fixed distance from my pond, but it's where I'm tying into. Okay. So I can create a feature line from that and assign elevations to it. This is the key again, assign elevations, and we'll pull elevations from existing ground. I can then take this, add it to the surface, the pond 1 surface, and then again have these supplementing factors. We'll leave those as default. And now we've tied into that feature line. Okay. Let's bring the pond down quite a bit, or let's actually bring it up. I'll grab this pond here. We'll do a raise lower. We'll bring it up 4 feet. We'll also grab, that point is fine. Okay. So now we're looking at a pond like this, something like this. Okay. So let's go in here and we'll kind of put a little spillway in here. What would that look like, right? A little emergency overflow there. Well, in a feature line right now, this is right here, this is basically my berm. Let's take this, let's do a stepped offset of it and have that stepped offset represent or where we put the cutout or the overflow spillway into it. So I'm going to take this guy, I'm going to run the stepped offset command, and that's right up here under edit geometry. Stepped offset, this is just like the AutoCAD offset command, but you have elevation control. So an offset distance, let's go 5 feet, go to the outside, and we'll go at a grade of 0%. Okay. Oops, let's meant to bring that up some. Let's grab this, raise lower, let's bring it up 1.5 feet. Okay, and now let's make sure this guy is in that surface as well. So adding it as a break line, same way we've done all the other ones. Okay. And if we take a look at this again in 3D, we can really understand what's going on. Nice little berm there. Okay, so let's put a little cutout in here. I can grab this feature line and I can insert some elevation points. Let's put one right there, one right there, right there, and right there. Okay, so 4 elevation points, and those are just reading the same elevation as is assigned to the entire feature line. But we can go and grab these now, these 2 points, and I can drop these down. So from 341.5, I can go down to 340. Same with this one, 340. Okay. And if I take a look at that surface now in 3D, you'll be able to see that cutout right in there. Okay. Okay. So what your pond looks like could be anything, right? How much volume do you need? What are the site geometrics? But this is a very kind of freehand, free-flowing way to grade. It's also the slowest or the least efficient way to do it. So the next couple examples are going to be using some grading tools and things will be a little faster for us. I do want to show one other thing here, which is pond volumes. Okay, if we're calling this feature line, this original feature line, our normal water line, and you should try to think in that way when you draw that initial feature line. Draw that at where that normal water line would be, so that that exact same feature line can be thrown into another surface to represent the top of water. So I'm going to grab this feature line. It's already in the one surface as a break line, but we can throw the same feature line into a different surface, and this one will be called Pond 1 Top. And temporarily I'm going to give this a style of contours and triangles so it shows up, and hit OK, and the same supplementing factors. And so what do I have now? I basically have a surface representing a full pond, right? So my volume is the difference between that pond top and the pond surface itself. So very simple volume calculations are done through the volumes dashboard. You'll find that on the Analyze tab. If I click on that, the panorama shows up. And right here, the third button over, I have the Create New Volume Surface button. So when you calculate volumes through the volumes dashboard, you actually create another surface, and it's called a volume surface. So this one is Pond 1 volume. And right here we have a base surface, and we can set that to Pond 1, and then we can set the comparison to Pond 1 top. And it calculates my volume there, 3,900 cubic yards. Okay, so certainly if I were to make a change, we should see that update. If I go grab this feature line there and I do a raise lower and we bring it down -1, okay, that surface updates. This says out of date. If I come over here, tell it to rebuild, now we're about 700 less, or no, or yeah, more cubic yardage in there. So that's pretty simple volume calculation, right? It gives us one number, the overall volume of it, okay? And what I always try to tell people to do is try to design this with the fewest number of feature lines as possible. Do what it takes to get the geometry you need. Do what it takes to get the triangulation that you need, okay? But always try to minimize the number of feature lines. Like this pond top surface is made from the exact same feature line that the overall pond surface is. That's a way to minimize it. Otherwise, if pond top was to be at a different level, a different contour or something perhaps, then I have to draw that feature line as well, or I have to extract a contour from the pond surface. It's not a very dynamic setup. So you always try to build things that are fairly dynamic. I'm going to turn off this pond top surface. I'm going to do one other thing here, and that's it works kind of nice in a design like this. Here's that volume surface. Let me turn that off as well. Okay, the contours are decent, but there's kind of some little kinks and stuff in it. It's mostly doing what we want. We can tweak these a little more, play with them a little more, but I want to also show you surface smoothing. And this is something where you might use it once you've kind of done your design, the volume is where you want, and you just kind of want nice looking contours. Want to pretty them up a little bit. So it's not going to take the design that we had here before we put this feature line in. It's not going to clean that up enough, but if there's just kind of a few jogs in here, it'll clean it up pretty nicely. So I pick on my surface, go to Edit Surface, and Smooth Surface. And I have a couple options here. I have Output Region. If I click on there, I get this Browse button, and I can come out here, and it prompts me for a few things. I'm going to pick the entire surface. We could have a polyline defined where we just pick that and only smooth a certain area of it. But in my case, I'm going to smooth the entire surface. Hit OK, and it cleans up those contours really nicely. Okay, so you should definitely be aware of what this does. If I look into Object Viewer now, what did it do? Well, I set a grid spacing of 5 by 5. It drops basically rains down a grid of 5 by 5 points on there that read the elevation from the surface they land on, and then those points are added to the surface. Now those points they're not Kogel points, they're not survey points, they're surface points dropped at a grid interval. So you kind of have to play with it a little bit. Did we need 5? Maybe 10 was enough. This adds data to your drawing. Okay, so a small pond like this, not a big deal, right? That took no time, perfect looking contours, works great. Huge site, don't just smooth the entire site. Do it in areas where the slopes are constantly changing, something like that. If you have typical slopes, sheet drainage in a parking lot or something like that, and it's just a constant slope, you shouldn't need to do smoothing like this. So that's one way to design. We're going to go and look at a couple other options here, and we're going to move through these a little bit quicker because we've kind of discussed some of the basics of grading a pond here. But next we're going to incorporate grading tools. So I'm going to jump over here. We're going to start again with a basic polyline. And I'm going to turn this thing into a feature line. So same start as before. We're going to put it in a site called Pond 2, and we're going to assign elevations from existing ground as a starting point. I can now pick my feature line and go to Elevation Editor, look at these grades, and we'll decide to set everything at 338. Okay, so that whole feature line is at elevation 338. And now from here, if we have some more typical slopes, we have, a 3-to-1 at 10 feet, for example, and then a 10-foot or a 3-foot bench at 10-to-1, something like that. These are accomplished much more easily using grading tools. Okay, you might think, well, let's take this feature line and do stepped offsets. Stepped offsets are great, but then there's no link between all of those feature lines you create. Grading tools basically do what a stepped offset does through different options of parameters that you can specify, but it links it. So that's one way to think about it. So we're going to go right up here to Grading Creation Tools. I'm going to pick on this first button here. We have to pick the site it's going to be in. We have to pick the group. That will be Pond 2. And the second button, we have to specify the target surface. What surface are we going to match into? That's existing ground. Then we're going to start out by doing some basic gradings. So for those of you who haven't used grading creation tools before, they're fairly simple. You have to define a feature line, and then you can attach one of 4 types of gradings to it. So in this case, we're going to pick a grade to distance. I'm going to do a create grading. I'm going to pick this feature line. And it may prompt you if you want to weed the feature line or not. This would be to remove points. It's somehow coming up that there might be too many points in here. We don't want that. We know we have the points we need, nothing more, nothing less. I'm going to say continue without weeding the feature line. And then the command line, it prompts us, select the grading side. We're going to grade to the inside. And we're going to say entire length. And we'll go a distance of 10 feet at a slope format. So we'll say S for slope. And we'll go -3 for a -3-to-1 slope. Okay, and it creates this grading. Now one thing we didn't do here is to go into our grading group properties, which is right over here, and to turn on automatic surface creation. When we do that, it automatically builds the surface for us. We don't need to add break lines or grading objects manually to the surface. And this is something to note actually. When you're creating surfaces from grading groups like this, from grading creation tools, never add anything manually to it. You're not adding break lines or grading objects manually to it. Let this tool do it for you. So we'll hit OK again, and now that surface is made. Okay. Again, we could accomplish the same thing with doing a stepped offset with that original feature line. But now when I grab this initial feature line, that one on the outside, anything I do to it is reflected on the other one. So if I do a raise lower and bring it down 1 foot, sorry, that wasn't easy to tell the difference. Let's bring it down a 1/2 foot or back up a 1/2 foot. And you'll see those contours shift. Okay, So this bottom edge here, which actually is a feature line, but it's like a linked or an embedded feature line that's connected to this grading object. That's the diamond object here. This grading object is then connected to the original feature line. So anything I do to that base feature line, this grading will move up and down with it. So a much more dynamic model. From here, let's do another grade to distance. Create grading. Pick this feature line, this embedded one now. I'll go to the entire length. We'll say yes. A distance of 3 feet at a slope of -10 to 1. And in this way, I've defined a bench in my pond. Okay. So you have these kind of parameters. They repeat themselves, right? I need another 3 to 1 at 10 feet, and then I need a 10 to 1 bench at 3 feet. Okay. There are criteria sets in here, and I've got one defined in here called pond. And if I set it to this one, what I have defined in here are different pond criteria. So if I check out this 3 to 1 at 10 feet, and if I go and edit this thing, I can open this up and go to the criteria tab, and I've spelled out the parameters that I want to be used when I create this grading. And what this means is that it won't prompt you each time. You can just click the feature line, hit enter basically, and it makes the object. So it makes these kinds of operations very, very quick. So this is 10 feet at a slope of -3 to 1. The way you get it to not prompt you is to lock down the lock column. Okay. So hit OK. Let's do one of these. Create grading. Pick this feature line here. We'll say entire length, and it builds it. Doesn't get much quicker than that. I've got another one in here. Bench 3 feet at 10 to 1. Same type of grading. Stay right in the command. Say yes, entire length, and there's my bench. Let's do another 3 to 1 at 10 feet, entire length, yes. Okay, so if I take a look at that in 3D now, we'll understand what's happening. 2 benches in there, 3 to 1 slopes. Okay, so these grading tools, they are great when you've got concentric design like this. Things are parallel, things are concentric. It's a standard 10 feet, 3 feet, 5 feet, whatever it is, whatever you're designing. These grading tools work great for this. You have a little hole in here, a little closed area. That's what the infill is for. Click on that. Click on the bottom here. You see it's highlighting that. Hit enter, and now we have a flat bottom to it. Okay. Even though we didn't see any contours show up, you've got to make sure to put that infill in there. If that's not in there and you go to calculate your volumes, it's going to miss that entire section there. So that entire area extruded up to the pond top surface, that volume will not be calculated. And you'll end up over-designing your pond. So we've got a feature line here. Let's go from here and let's go up. So we're going to go out from here and we're going to design a berm. And I've got a berm inside grading. What does this one look like? Let's take a look at this grading criterion. This is set to relative elevation of 3 feet. Let's change it. Let's set it to 1.5. And then a slope of 3 to 1. Okay. It's locked down again, so it's not going to prompt me. So it might even be helpful to call out 1.5 foot height or something like that. You can customize these any way you want. These, of course, they save in your template just like styles do. So berm inside 1.5. Let's do a create grading. I'll pick this feature line. The grading side is going to be to the outside, and this time we're going to say no on the entire length because we don't want to grade all the way around. We want a spillway over on this corner. So I'm going to grade from right there all the way around to right there. And it prompts you when you pick. So I pick that location, and then it gives me a station. I hit enter to accept that, and it creates that berm face there. Okay, I can do a berm top. That's a fairly simple flat berm top that I've defined. I can pick this feature line and say entire length, and now I get a berm top. Okay, so we've defined that berm inside there and then the berm top right there. Now we have to spell out the area in between here. I've got a spillway grading defined here, and all this one is a distance of 5 feet at a slope of 0%. Pretty simple grading, and it's unlocked, so I can type in a different value. So let's put that spillway grading in there. Create grading. Pick this feature line. The grading side will be to the outside, and we're going to go in roughly the middle third of this opening here. And a distance, let's do 7 feet actually. So 7, actually that looks a little too long. Let's use the edit grading command right up here. We can hover over that grading and highlights it. We click on it and it prompts us for a value. Again, let's go back to that default 5 feet. Now here's the great thing. When you define two gradings in Civil 3D, and then you have a gap between them, what do we want this to do? Well, I basically want it to transition from this slope down to this slope, right? There's a transition tool that if you use it correctly, meaning you set up two gradings and then leave a gap in between, that you want to use, you then want to use this create transition tool. And the way this works is you pick the feature line, then you pick the space in between, and it just fills that in. Okay, so if I do the same on this side, pick anywhere in the gap between here, and it'll fill that in. I escape out of the command. We take a look at this. Zoom in there. Can really tell if we go like this. Okay, so there's that cutout or that spillway, right? Okay, from here I can do a daylight at 3:1. That's another grading I've defined. I can select create grading. Pick that outside feature line. It's one feature line all the way around now because we've filled it in with transitions and such. Say yes. And now it daylights to existing ground. Okay. So that daylight tied into existing ground there. Okay. So very simple, quick way to design and grade a pond, right? The beauty of this way, it's very quick. You can use these grading criteria, and everything is built on this one feature line. So grabbing this feature line, for example, and raising it up another foot, I should see everything rebuild, and I should see that daylight update. So now we brought the whole thing up. Has to daylight or go out further to match into existing. Okay. Just like the last one, I would take this feature line and I would add it to a break line and to another surface, and that would be my pond 2 top. And that would make a volume surface in the exact same way. So if you have fairly simple pond design, these grading tools, there's nothing quicker than doing it like this. But in many cases, we don't have just one feature line or one shape like this that defines the makeup of our pond, right? Because everything in here, all the contours, everything is concentric to that one feature line. In many cases, that's not the design we want or we need. So let's go over to this other example here. I'm starting with a couple polylines here. This is going to be roughly near my top of pond, kind of like what we had done before. That's just a 2D polyline there. And then the bottom one, the low point or the bottom of the pond is going to be this polyline basically. What it means is we're going to have steeper slopes on this side and then very flat slopes on this side. Okay. So how do you do this? Because a grading object we wouldn't be able to grade from this to this polyline with a grading object, because it's constant slope, constant width. There is a way to put some transitions in here, but that's not the way to handle something like this. But we do have some stuff we want to be typical in here. Like I might say I want this feature, this polyline here, I want to grade down at 5 feet at a 4:1, and then I want to put an infill in the bottom. Or perhaps from this polyline I want to go up at 4:1 for 5 feet, right? A lot of different scenarios here. But what we can do is, instead of just grabbing these and turning them into feature lines and throwing them in the surface as break lines, we can use a combination of grading objects to define the typical slopes and the typical widths. And then we can use infills and supplementary feature lines to handle the changing or the constantly changing sloped areas, which would be areas like this. So we'll grade this, and then we'll look at how do you tie it into this adjacent parking lot here. So I'm going to start with my grading tools right up, excuse me, not the grading tools, the feature line tool. We're going to create feature lines from an object, and we're going to pick both of these right off the bat. And we're going to put these into a site called Pond 3 and curb, and you're going to see later on why it's also the curb one. Okay, so some of these curb gradings on this adjacent parking lot, those are going to be in the same site, and you'll see why in a little while. So assign elevations, hit OK. We're going to pull elevations from existing ground to start. And there's our feature line. So the elevation of this parking lot right here, if I hover over that surface, it's about 337. So we're going to grab this feature line, go to our elevation editor, and we're going to set that to 333. I'm also going to grab this feature line here. I'm going to set that to 330. Okay, so it's two different feature lines. And we're not adding them to the surface as break lines. Remember what we said, if we're going to be using grading tools, grading creation tools, you don't add things to that grading creation tool surface. You let the grading tools themselves create it. So let's bring those grading tools up, grading creation tools. Starting on the far left here, we have to pick our site. That will be Pond 3 and curb, and then our group name is Pond 3 and curb as well. So we'll hit OK. At this point, we'll go right to the grading group properties. We'll verify that automatic surface creation is turned on. That looks good. So we'll hit OK. Now I'm going to go back to my standard set here, my pond set. We're going to look at that one. And we're going to do a 3:1 at 10 feet. I can pick this guy, grade to the outside, the entire length, a 3:1 at 10 feet. Let's go to my general grading set here. Let's do a grade to distance. And let's grab this inner feature line. We'll go to the inside, we'll go the entire length, and we'll go a distance of 5 feet at a slope of -3:1. Okay. So right now on my surface, there's parking lot stuff on the surface too, but if you look at just the pond, I've got this piece down here, excuse me, this piece down here, and I've got this piece out here, and I actually made a mistake on that. That should have been sloping upwards, not downwards. We wanted to go at a positive 3:1. So I'm going to delete that grading, this one out here, and we'll redo that one with this graded distance one. So we'll pick this feature line, select the grading side, that'll be to the outside, we'll go to the entire length. Let's actually do 8 feet at a slope of 3:1. Okay. So from right here, what is this area in here? This is an open, or excuse me, a closed space within the same site. Anytime you have that, it means you can create an infill. And if I click that infill button and hover over this, you're going to see it highlights, and it draws in or fills in that area. So, but is this what we want? Not necessarily. Again, it's not triangulating from this lower piece, this lower feature line all the way up to there. And we're saying we want a constant grade from right there all the way up to there. What we're getting instead is it's triangulating straight across here. So this whole area is just flat right up here. We don't want that. We want it sheet draining all the way down here. So we have to put in what I call supplementary feature lines. So I'm going to go to Create Feature Line. We're going to again go in the same site, hit OK. I'm going to go from the midpoint right there. And when you draw a feature line manually like this, it prompts you for elevation, but it's reading whatever you snap to. So it read 330, so hit enter and accept that. And then come up here and we'll do a midpoint snap again. I take it back. We're going to go right up to this point right here. So it reads that elevation as well. Okay. And because I drew that right in the infill, it's going to triangulate right to that feature line. So let's draw another one like that. I'll go from the midpoint right here, accept that elevation, and then come right up here to the end point of that original feature line and accept that elevation. Okay. Let's take a look at our surface in 3D now. So now we've got that constant slope here. We've got a couple other issues. For one, it broke our infill in there. Well, it didn't break it. It's just that we created another closed region, so we have to drop another infill right there, just as we do at the bottom of our pond. And the other thing we're going to notice is that it's not triangulating at any kind of interval along there. We can fix this or kind of clean this up some by adding some elevation points in here. And again, you want to do it sparingly. Do it as much as you need to kind of get the triangulation to work the way you want. So if I escape out of there and I go back up here, let's put our infills in. Hit enter. We'll do another infill down here. Hit enter. And we're also going to take these feature lines and we're going to put some elevation points in there. So I'm going to click up here, insert elevation point. I'm going to say at an increment of 10 feet. And again, we do this when we're really kind of trying to tweak the contours at the end here, really clean them up. So picking that feature line, insert elevation point at an increment of 10 feet. And now we get triangulation much more like what we expect. Okay. A surface smoothing totally would clean up those contours. So this is a way to have some constant slopes and constant widths, but also some kind of some varying slopes, and you handle that with infills. It works pretty nicely. So how do we tie into this parking lot though? Well, let's put a daylight grading on the back side of this. So we'll go grade to surface, do a create grading, and it says pick a target surface. So we have to prompt or select existing ground. That's where we're tying into. And I'm going to pick this feature line up here, and we're going to say no for entire length because we're only going to grade on this east side of it. So we're going to go right about there, all the way around to right about there. And we're going to go at a slope of 3:1 for both cut and fill. Okay. It's a little bit low. We're going to pick our feature lines here, and we're going to lower this whole thing. So pick those 4 feature lines. And I can do a raise lower on those. We'll go down 3 feet, we'll say. Let's look at how this is turning out in Object Viewer here. Okay. So we're daylighting up there. Now what we have is just this area to fill in here. And here's where putting the curb in the same site and the same surface as this pond, if you have a simple enough scenario like this, this works pretty nice because we can again use the infill concept that we did down here. We can use this in this area if we just close off these gaps here with feature lines. So what does that look like? Let's draw a polyline from right here. Turn my O-snaps on, go from right there to an arc on the second point, something like that. Let me adjust this a little bit. Okay, do the same thing on the other side. Just drawing a simple polyline in here, like that. Okay, and we're going to turn these into feature lines. So create feature lines from objects, pick both of these, and turn them into feature lines. So we're putting them on the same site and we're assigning elevations. And this time it's different. The elevations need to come from existing ground because this is basically our grading limits right here. And where we snap to at the endpoints, those exact endpoints are hitting existing ground too. So the pond surface and existing ground at those endpoints of the polylines are the exact same elevation. So we'll hit OK. I run my infill command and it'll fill in this area. Because all we're really saying is we've got a pond there, we've got an edge of a curb, and we just want it to triangulate in between those. Okay, so you'll notice with my parking lot, I left the daylight grading short on that side. I did the same on this side, and then we're just connecting the dots and filling this area in. Now, in the same way I drew these feature lines in here, we could draw in a couple feature lines up here, and we could get that to clean up a little better. But I'll let you guys kind of experiment with that on your own. So these are kind of three examples, different ways you can grade ponds. One is a very kind of free-flowing, nothing standard, nothing typical going on. It's just feature lines as break lines on the surface, and then also using a Kogel point for a bottom. And then we use grading tools all based on one feature line. That's fairly straightforward. It works really quickly if you have these criteria sets defined, the pond criteria sets. And then lastly, we use the combination of some changing slopes as well as some constant slopes. So one other thing I want to touch on here. We looked at analysis, calculating volumes. We do the same kind of thing over here. But what about taking this and getting some stage storage numbers? And how do you then export that into SSA? It's fairly straightforward. We have to take our normal water line. So what is our normal water line? Well, in this case, I'm going to say it's that feature line right there. And that feature line is at an elevation of 332.667. Okay, so there's a nice little trick here. We go into our surface style. We verify that user contours are turned on. Okay. Then I go into surface properties. I go to my analysis tab and I do a user-defined contours analysis type. I set the type to, or the number to 1, and I type this number in here, 332.667. Okay. When I hit OK, what it's going to do is it's going to give me a contour line right there. Okay. Now this happened to land right on the feature line, but this is a nice way to get your normal water line, whatever that might be. You can go and define that elevation, and then that contour will be turned on. When that contour is turned on, we can then pick on the surface and we can extract objects from the surface, and we can pull those user-defined contours out of here. Okay. And what I end up with now is a polyline. Okay, so this is all steps required to do the stage storage. I can take this thing and I can run an offset command of 0.1 feet and just offset it to the outside there. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and temporarily make that an outer boundary to my pond surface. So I'm going to add data boundaries. It's going to be an outer boundary. We're going to use that polyline right there. Okay. So to use the stage storage tool, you have to trim up your surface so that it's only showing contours that you want to be used in the stage storage that are involved in that calculation. Okay, so I can now pick on this surface, analyze, and I have stage storage right up here. I can pick on that, get a report title here. I could call it Pond 3 Volumes. There's a number of different calculation methods. The main thing I want to point out here is how you define the basin. Okay, so I click on Define Basin, and I can define the basin from surface contours. So here's where it's important that we've trimmed up that surface. So I click on Define, go pick my surface, and then it throws me back to this window and it populates every contour that's in there with the areas, the incremental depth, so on and so forth. I get my stage storage. Now from here I can do a couple things. I can insert the table, okay, and when we back out of this we'll see that that's an AutoCAD table in place. I can also say Save Table, and I'll save it as an ACCSST file, and I'll overwrite that one that I'd done before. This is what you export to bring it into SSA. So I'll hit Save, replace that one. If I close out of this now, I'll see that table. This is an AutoCAD table. It's not dynamic. It's just a one-time report, basically, of that information. Okay. So that's stage storage information. I can jump into SSA. So this is a standalone product, storm and sanitary analysis, similar to HydroCAD, similar to HydroFlow. Okay, it's in here. I'm not going to go into this use of this software, but one of the items we can define is a storage node. Storage node is a pond. So I'm going to place this in here. If I go into the properties of this storage node, I can define what the values are, or the size of this storage node is. If I go to storage curve is how I bring in the ACCST file. So I pick this browse button, and in here is where I will then have the load option. So I click on load, and I go and browse to that ACCSST file. Hit open, okay, and that exact definition of my pond is now brought in here. You can do all this stuff manually in here, but the interface in between Civil 3D and SSA, and HydroFlow too for that matter, is really nice. The information comes right in for analysis, and you really don't have to recreate much at all. So that's how you load it into SSA. Pretty handy, pretty nice tool. So that's most of what I wanted to show today, just some examples of different ways to design ponds. Certainly everyone's going to be different, but look at these different ideas. You know, I went through it pretty quickly. I wasn't doing a kind of pick and click training so much, but more of a showing you ideas and concepts. So a couple of other items to mention here. We're real excited about our upcoming event, Midwest U. It used to be called Minnesota University. We had great success with it last year. We had 55 technical classes, real technical workshops. They were basically taught by some of the engineers at CTC here, but majority it was power users we brought in from the industry, and so it was very well received. It's quite similar to Autodesk University in that way. So we encourage you to check that out. Go to midwestu.com. March 26th and 27th is when it's happening. We've got a lot of Autodesk folks that come to it, including Lynn Allen. She always shows up for it. So it's going to be at Mystic Lake this year. We were at the Convention Center last year, but this year it's going to be Mystic Lake, so that should be a lot of fun. Some evening time entertainment, and of course can stay right on site there for those of you coming from out of town. So with that, we thank you for watching. As always, this will be posted on YouTube, and you can review it there. If you have any questions, please feel free to email them in, submit them, and we will get back to you and address those in a timely manner. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.